So the final panel on a long and very rich day of discussion. It's an excellent panel. The papers are excellent. And we have a lot of expertise. We have, particularly a lot of expertise in Susan Martin, who has been following the debate in Washington, D.C. For quite a while with a very front row seat. We all know Erica de la Garza, who organized this whole event, and her co-authors, Patricia Gross and Ariana Hatchett. Charles Foster, who I understand is the most renowned immigration attorney in Houston, and my father sends his regards. And Dan Tishner, who wrote, I think, what's widely recognized as one of the best political science books on U.S. immigration reform of, of recent memory. I guess we'll go in the order that we're on the program. Are we going to start with Susan?
Oh, no. Oh, sorry. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. So we'll go in the order that's on the program, and then I'll jump in at the end, and then we'll have discussion.
What is the order? Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. So on behalf of my co-authors, I'm going to share some thoughts on U.S. newspaper and the immigration debate. And I'm going to stick to my notes so that I can, use the 10 minutes that I have. So there is a direct and complex relationship between public opinion and the policymaking process. But I think we can, for the most part, agree that public officials are reluctant to take a stand if they face the probability of widespread disapproval by the public. We also know that the media plays a very important role in shaping public opinion. And so we were very excited to dive into this exploration of the relationship between the media, specifically newspapers, and the policymaking process in regards to immigration reform. Little did we know what a complicated journey it would be. But in any case, and by the way, let me just, forgot to go, okay. So in any case, our study takes a small snapshot of immigration coverage by 10 newspapers during the period of January 1st, 2012 through January 31st, 2013. Before we get into that, we'd like to mention a couple of, or give you some context on the new media industry and mention a couple of media theories and studies. Discerning the role of the media plays in the policymaking process is already difficult, but it's even more difficult if we consider the dramatic transformation that the industry has suffered in the past 30 years. Let me do this. Okay, sorry. So the new media landscape has seen a vast proliferation of media sources and on the ways that the public access this media, and an increase in audience fragmentation. Broadcast media, for example, no longer has the big three dominant networks whose programming was crafted to attract the greatest number of viewers, but instead, we have a myriad of media sources with highly specialized programming attracting narrow, more homogeneous audiences. So we have media hosts and provocateurs like Rush Limbaugh or Lou Dobbs, who aim to reach niche audiences with smaller number of viewers, and they can actually afford to offend the public, which was something unthinkable 3 decades ago. In terms of the theories, we're going to mention agenda setting and framing. The media uses different, is this working? Okay, my presentation got stuck, but in any case, help is coming, I'm sure. Okay, Kevin in the back. Here he is. When that happens, what do I need to do? Escape? There, yeah. Okay, so the media uses different mechanisms to influence public opinion, and it can serve either as an obstacle or a facilitator in the policymaking process. So an original theory first established, the original agenda setting theory first established by McCombs and Shaw in 1968, states that the media sets the public opinion by deciding what to cover and what not to cover. So decisions on what story to write or air, the length and amount of time devoted to a story, the frequency of coverage, these all contribute to the importance the public ultimately places on a topic. But today's agenda-setting research, okay, I'm glad this is happening to me, the in-house person, and not to our guests, but, okay, there we go. But today's agenda-setting research makes a more ambitious claim, arguing that the media not only tells people what to think about, but also how they should think and feel about the issue. So the way the public thinks about a topic is influenced by the attributes that are emphasized or ignored by the media. So coverage of an issue in a negative, contentious way can sway the public in one direction, and thus further limit the prospects of a legislator to publicly support the issue. Framing. Oh, come on. Okay, so framing assumes that the way an issue is characterized in the news can have an influence on how the audience understands it. So it refers to the way an argument is packaged to make it accessible to the public and encourages a particular interpretation of a given issue. So as Freiberg and others have pointed out, how framing is used by the media in this debate has consequences on how Americans respond to legislation and perceive immigrants, as well as their role in society. So a journalist's decision to present immigrants as threats to the economy and public safety, or as contributors to the American society and way of life, matters greatly. There are many excellent studies and by first-rate media experts and scholars, like the ones we see here. But one of the studies, which is perhaps the most comprehensive that we've found to date, regarding media influence on immigration, was done by the Brookings in 2009, called Democracy in the Age of New Media, a report on the media and the immigration debate. This study brought together several media scholars and experts, including Roberto Zurro, who analyzed 27 years worth of data. That's from 1980 to 2007. This period included a lot of critical transformations, like the change in the media landscape that we just described. There was also an increase in the size of the immigration population. This is also when the last significant reform to the immigration system, IRCA, happened. Not only it covered this wonderful period of time, but it also, the scope of the database is remarkable. It analyzed news content from 5 media sectors: cable, network, radio, online political blogs, newspapers. So as part of the findings, Zurro describes 3 main tendencies from the data. One is episodic coverage. The second one, a focus on criminality. And the third, that the content of the pieces they studied was the main actors in those pieces were immigrants and the government, leaving out the other actors, which we know are also very important. And we'll come back to this media tendencies in a minute to describe what the preliminary findings in our study. So the hypothesis of our study was whether the media we sampled were actually agenda setters on immigration reform or sounding boxes for the prevailing political discourse. As mentioned before, we looked at data from 10 newspapers in a 13-month period. 6 of those newspapers were randomly selected through LexisNexis, and they were the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Daily News, USA Today, and the Washington Times. The other 4 were handpicked from 4 major US cities with high foreign-born populations and Latino populations. Those were the Chicago Tribune, the Houston Chronicle, the Los Angeles Times, and the Miami Herald. We read and classified all the articles as positive, negative, or neutral content. The data results were conflicting, and we will need to conduct further research in order to arrive to any conclusions. However, we'd like to share a couple of preliminary observations, mostly from the 4 papers of the major US cities we just mentioned. So we read and classified over 400 articles from those papers. And going back to the tendencies, when we look at the episodic coverage of immigration that the Brookings study found, our preliminary findings saw the same tendency. So by covering immigration as an episode, the volume of coverage rises and falls dramatically, and that creates sudden reactions from the audience, which tend to make the audience associate the topic with crisis and controversy. Whereas we all know that the 11 million immigrants did not come in overnight, and it was a gradual process, but the fact that the coverage is episodic makes it look that way. And let's look at a chart just showing the frequency of the articles. So in our data, so what we see, and again, this is from those 4 major newspapers, is a spike in June 2012 and the other big spike in January 2013. So the one in June corresponds to Deferred Action of Childhood Arrivals, so DACA. President Obama announces it in June. Then it goes into effect in August. Then we have the November election. And in January, what we see is the Gang of 8 presenting, this bipartisan Senate proposal. The other tendency that the Brookings study mentions is a focus on illegality by immigrants. And in this, our data goes the other way. So what happened, media coverage of immigration reform proposals in 2006 and 2007, which is the period that, part of the period that the Brookings study analyzes, disproportionately focused on illegality, and partly because of what we just saw, the fragmentation of the media and the amount of different sources, and also because we had the beginning of the 24-hour news cycle. So media framed the issue in a way that made the public and policymakers associate the influx of immigrants with violations of the law, the failure of the public sector, and so on. In contrast, our preliminary data shows a change in discourse and in media framing. The data focus less on the illegality and more on dealing with the young undocumented population brought to the U.S. through no fault of their own, and the devastation caused by deportation policy. Perhaps this new framing by the media, coupled with other political realities we've analyzed throughout the day, allowed more room for policymakers to take a public stand in favor of immigration reform. But was the media we studied trying to set the agenda or being a sounding board of the sentiment expressed by politicians and other influential opinion leaders? We'll need more data to provide a good answer to that. Finally, the last tendency mentioned by the Brookings study was an emphasis on immigrants and government as the main actors. And this we found that continues to be the same. So the main actors are still, in our data, the immigrants and government, although portrayed in a very different light than back in 2006 and 2007. But we leave out actors like consumers and employers, which are a critical part of the equation. Finally, I'm going to show a simple graph that shows when we divided the content of the 400 plus articles from those 4 newspapers into positive, neutral, and negative, as you can see, and we divided it between before the elections and after the elections, and there's really virtually no change. For the 13-month period, most of the coverage, the content was either positive or neutral. There were virtually no negative articles. So this is just a small snapshot of a much larger picture, and we'll need more data to determine how well this represents the bigger picture. Thank you.
Very impressive with your timing. I'm sure all of the panelists will follow your good model. Charles.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so aim for 10 to 12. I'll give you a signal at 10.
Well, good. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Erica and Tony for putting together this important program, all-day program on immigration reform. When I asked and they told me I was going to be on the last panel, I didn't think anyone would be here all day long, so I'm pleased to see so many of you have either came late or stayed all day. It's obviously a very important article. I'm pleased to be here with my comrade in arms, Stan Merrick. Stan and I worked on this for years together, and this is very exciting times. I think everyone has their own opinion, but This is clearly, in terms of all the forces coming together to bring about immigration reform, the best prospects since the morning, frankly, of 9/11/2001. I was working for President Bush at that point on immigration reform policy, and President Vicente Fox had been on the White House lawn just a few days before that, and everyone was very optimistic. President Bush had a lot of wind in his back in terms of having been a newly elected Republican president, and the Democrats were essentially favorable, and I think we were all optimistic. But the terrible events of 9/11, it was among all the horrific tragedies, it was very clear that there was no prospects at all for immigration reform whatsoever. And then in 2004, I spoke to the president about when we're going to get back to this. He said after the election, and this is sort of reminiscent of the last reference to the last panel about what happened. Why didn't President Obama get to it? President Bush said to me he was going to, as soon as he got reelected, he said, let's get reelected and then we're going to do this. He went off on Social Security reform, and by the time he beat he kept on beating that dead horse until he was the last person in America to realize that that wasn't going anywhere. By the time he got to immigration reform, it was too late. And that's essentially what happened to President Obama. I remember, and because I was, again, working with the White House on this a little bit, in 2009, when he went down to Guadalajara, met with President Calderon. The president said, he says, immigration reform, it's on my list, it's on the top of the list, right after health care, climate, environmental issues, and reform of our financial markets. And so my heart sank because I knew those three big issues were going to kill any possibility of getting to immigration reform. Well, my talk is on legal framework, philosophical framework. I'll stick with the legal part of it. But it's tried to say we need immigration reform, but people really don't really think about it. Also, when I speak about this, I say we, in a sense, our legal system, we've created undocumented or illegal immigration. I'll explain that, why we have the so-called broken system as well. When you think about it, historically, we wanted to fill up the country, so we didn't have much in the way of a complicated immigration system for the biggest part of our history because we wanted people to come. We only excluded classes of undesirable individuals, criminal aliens, people likely to become public charges, particularly people we were concerned about plagues from Europe that had communicable diseases. It wasn't until we were concerned after World War I about some of those diseases and isms coming over from Europe that we imposed the first quotas. But interestingly, those quotas were imposed only on the Eastern Hemisphere. And one thing that's remarkable in this debate, we had no, and of course, once you impose quotas, it begged the question, was it going to be first come, first served? No, it was going to be based upon the national origin system, and that's an entirely different speech. But the point of all that is we imposed no quotas at all on the Western Hemisphere. So for most of our history, you could have had any number of people immigrating legally from Latin America because there were no limits as long as you were not an excludable class. It was the 65 Act that imposed the first quotas. It went into effect in 68. For some of us, 68, I was just starting to practice law about that time. It wasn't that far long ago. But I often say that we created, to some extent, I grew up on the border in McAllen. I used to cross the border illegally to hunt on the other side of the river and thought nothing about it. But, and then for me, undocumented immigration, as a kid, I'd work with undocumented. They'd cross over, they just found some place on the river, someone couldn't see them. But as we began to cut off all legal options, we imposed quotas, we ended the Bracero programs. By 1974, President Ford had appointed Father Hesburgh of Notre Dame to head an immigration commission to study this phenomena of immigration, of illegal immigration, not focusing on the fact that we created to some extent by both beginning to harden the border and creating very few legal options. So just fast forward today, it's tried to say, people say we want people to come in legally. We're not against immigration. We want them to come in legally, get in line, and come in legally. Well, that's a myth because the worldwide quota, there is no viable temporary workers program, and the worldwide quota for low-skilled, below professionals really is something like 5,000, it is 5,000 a year. As a lawyer, there are arguments they should not count against that quota, the immediate family members, but they do. So effectively, we have a worldwide quota of somewhere a little bit more than 1,000 people a year that can come in legally to do the work that many Americans, because just like in the case of Stan's family, the Czech immigrants, they've come up, they don't want to do that anymore. Czechs, Stan got to go to A&M. I mean, that was a burden, but at least his son got to go to UT Law School. So they keep on getting higher and higher on the social scales. He did go to Harvard too along the way, but so we have this broken system. President George W. Bush is controversial in many circles, but I can clearly say that he was the very best president ever in the history of America. Very low standard on immigration because very few presidents really ever paid attention to this issue, but he really cared about this. And when he ran for president in 2000, I was working for him as a policy advisor. He understood that as part of smart border enforcement, we needed to have a legal system. He told me one day, he said, all these people are coming in, and once they get in, they're someone's favorite construction worker or strawberry picker or nanny in their home. He said, why can't we put those people into a legal system? So he recognized how critical it was to develop a functional temporary workers program. And he also said something else to me. He said that because of the perceived failures of the 86 Act, Immigration Control Reform Act of 86, and I testified about that, and there's a lot of reasons why that failed. Most of what is given actually is not very accurate. But anyway, the word legalization, which was translated to say as amnesty, the word amnesty by that time had become a dirty word in 2000 when he was running for president. He said, Charles, we do not support amnesty for 2000. So we redefined in that, as we were going forward in that campaign, we redefined amnesty as what happened in 86. People, if you were here prior to January 1, 1982, you were eligible to apply directly for lawful permanent residency. Cutting in line became the expression, and you would receive your lawful permanent residency or so-called green card on a conditional basis, and 2 years later you could remove that conditions, and you had other requirements. But he said to me, no, we can't do that. So out of that came the idea that no one would cut in line. You'd get and so since 2000, almost every version of anything that's been discussed on the Republican side or the Democratic side along these lines has that formula that people, no criminal records, they pay a fine, pay back taxes. Some cases they commit to they go through an English language civics program, but they get nothing more initially than a temporary status, and they stay in that status and theoretically until those people already in line. Of course, there really is no line. They're just petitions that have been filed, petitions based upon family, close, immediate relations or close relationship with U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residency, or employer petitions. I'm going to skip the few investor cases that there are. So people get in line through that. 70% of all the people that qualify do so through family relations. Ironically, a lot of those people in line are here illegally because the quotas, the backlogs mean that their relative, their U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse or adult child or parent may have petitioned for them, but they have to wait in line. They're waiting here in line illegally because of the backlogs under the quota. But be that as it may, you define that line maybe 8 or 10 years after that, then the individuals can apply for lawful permanent residency. So that's the heart of comprehensive immigration reform, that you've got to deal with 11 million estimated here. They go first through a temporary program, those without any serious criminal records. The Congress will debate whether that waiting period is 8 years, 10 years, 12 years. And in order to cut that line down, they're probably going to have to increase put additional visa numbers into the quota system so that, if not, in some cases for brothers and sisters, that line could be 12, 13 years or longer. So in order to be consistent with that, they're going to have to do something. And then at the end of that line, they'll be eligible to apply for lawful permanent residency. By the way, I've told the President and others, I was just with Secretary Napolitano at a meeting the other day, that I wish everyone would quit talking about a pathway to citizenship, because that's really, I think, inflames the conservative right more and Republicans more than it should, because when they hear that, when people, their constituents hear that, that sounds like instant citizenship, and they're all going to go out and vote Democratic. But we're really talking about a long pathway to becoming a lawful permanent resident. And as any lawful permanent resident, once you get that status, you're eligible to apply for U.S. citizenship if you're a person of good moral character and you reside here a majority of the time 5 years later. Now, as Professor Jones earlier pointed out, large numbers of people, once they acquire that status, I think he said that the percentage rate was something like 18% that actually bother to apply for citizenship. So why the terminology is used all the time, pathway to citizenship, is really a misnomer, because many people will never get around to doing that. As long as they're eligible, that's the important thing. How much more time do I have?
2 or 3 minutes?
2 or 3 more time. Why did the 86 Act that we're trying to fix now, why did it fail? The political class, they keep on saying over and over again, we didn't have the enforcement at the border. But the 86 Act really was going to fix that. Senators, I testified again on that. I worked with Senator Al Simpson, who was, along with Congressman Rodino of Louisville, Kentucky, were really the two people that crafted that legislation. He told me after they passed that act, he says, Charles, we're not going to have a single illegal immigrant ever again in America because they'll never get a job. And I testified before Congress and chaired on behalf of the state of Texas a task force appointed by Governor Mark White that until they fix the, by the way, once we said employers like Stan had the responsibility to determine who's authorized to work in America, that begged the question, how are you going to determine that? And ultimately, it came down to a single document. To determine work authorization, it was going to be the Social Security card. And as was pointed out, the ones you could get into a flea market, the quality, and we had testimony for this task force that I chaired, but the quality of the ones you get in any flea market was much better than the ones that are issued to us, issued still today on a low-cost basis on paper that almost dissolves in your finger if it gets wet. And yet, why didn't, at the time I testified, I and others, Senator Lloyd Benson in particular, advocated, everyone's against the national ID card. Sounds too Orwellian, too European. But the idea was we would fix this by making the de facto national ID card is our Social Security card. Why not upgrade it? We've upgraded our driver's license. When I was a kid, it was on a piece of paper. Now it's a hard plastic with all sorts of stuff. Our passport is a technological wonder today with all the stuff that's recorded in that. Why not upgrade that basic card? And you could do so not for all of us instantaneously, but for people coming into the job market, new people being born as they apply for Social Security cards and that type of thing. If we had fixed that Social Security card, that would have come a long way. E-Verify does half of it, but unfortunately, it's only half the job. Not only is there discrepancies, but about half the people that are seeking employment are using a name that matches a valid Social Security card. They've just taken someone else's identity. It's not necessarily that they've stolen it from a stranger. They've stolen it from a relative, even sometimes their own children, because their children are U.S. citizens. They'll take their number and name and use that Social Security number. So you have to do both. So one reason the 86 Act failed is because we did not fix the national, if you're going to identify people and employers are going to play a big role, at least it should work. And my final point, before I get the pulled off, is the following. What was it? The final point was why it did not pass. The temporary workers program. This, I'm actually, historically, I've identified with both the Democratic parties at time growing up and later the Republican Party, but now sort of occurs in both their houses because they're both sort of guilty or hypocritical at times. The Democrats love helping the undocumented that are here, but because of the unions, they question about those that are going to come in the future. The Republicans are sort of the reverse of that. But one of the reasons that failed was there was no viable temporary workers program. People will continue to come across that border, around the border, under the border, over the border fences or what have you. If we have a strong magnet of jobs here, that's called the pull factor. More and more coming from, it used to be historically a huge percentage were always from Mexico, maybe 70% or higher. And then after the civil wars in Central America, about 30% from Central America, and those numbers are reversing. More and more people are coming from Central America, fewer from Mexico now. But there's going to be that pressure on the border, and you have to have legal avenues for people to come in where there are shortages of U.S. workers and where the employer can prove that they're unable to find a qualified, willing, and able U.S. worker at the prevailing wage. How you do that is already established. We do that for high-skilled workers. That's what our law firm does. We're the second or third largest law firm in the world on immigration. If you're biggest in the U.S., that makes you the biggest in the world, because this is still where everyone wants to come to the United States because we're such a great country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I should have mentioned that Dan has an excellent edited volume on immigration as well.
So Mark is saying this because we co-edited a volume together, which is good because he had to suffer through a 50-page paper I wrote, so he's well used to my turgid prose. So let me start off by thanking Erica and Tony and the Baker Institute for inviting me to participate in today's conference. And my marching orders were to think about the congressional dynamics of immigration reform. And so what I'd like to do today is talk about 5 of those dynamics, although I know I'm on the clock. So if Mark gives me the hook, maybe it'll end up being 3. But I'll try to do a good job of giving you all 5. And where I want to start, the first is what I would describe as avoidance. And what I mean by that is most members of Congress want to avoid immigration reform like the plague. This is an issue that is very fraught for them. Immigration reform has typically, when it's broad, comprehensive, is almost always very hard to achieve and long in coming. So Mr. Foster was informing us about the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. Any guess how long that took? It really began with Peter Rodino in the early 70s with employer sanctions legislation, had a tortured path in the Carter administration and so forth. Long and short of it is 15 years, at least, depending when you want to start the clock. So these things take a long time. Why? Why is it that this is an issue that's so fraught for members? Why is it they want to avoid it? Why does it take so long? And the first, today we could point to something that one of the audience members for the last panel pointed out, which is partisan polarization, as 2 excellent congressional scholars, Thomas Mann and Norm Ornstein, pointed out in their new book, borrowing from Austin Ramney of Berkeley. What we have today are parliamentary parties in a separation of powers system. So that polarization is something that obviously makes it very tough. But there's a longer reason why it's been so hard to get things done on this issue. And it's because of conflict, very deep conflict within parties on this issue. So for Democrats, traditionally, there's been a great divide between those who are sort of pro-labor Democrats, worried about economic protection and so forth, opposed by, within the Democratic ranks, immigrant rights advocates, ethnic groups, and so forth. That's less so today. Organized labor has made a significant shift over time on this, so now they're very much on almost all issues in camp with other Democrats. So in the past you had pro-labor liberals at odds with civil rights liberals. That's really no longer the case. It still creates tensions for centrist Democrats from swing states. But the more profound differences within parties today is clearly within the Republican Party. And what you have over time, this is not just a new thing, is profound differences between pro-immigration Republicans who are thinking about business interests, employer interests, and so forth, and more recently with demographics, versus those who have been more border hawks and concerned with their base. And Marco Rubio is a great study in this. I don't have a lot of time, so I just say he's an interesting study in this conundrum because he wants the Republican Party to be a national party, not a regional congressional party. He sees that, here's an area where he can exercise leadership, put his stamp on something that's significant, that he could get reform done and work across the aisle. But what's the obvious challenge for him? How does that play in the 2016 Republican primaries when 60% of your base is not so happy with the things that are going to go into a grand bargain? It kind of captures the dilemmas on this issue. So long in coming, an issue that is often avoided by members of Congress. Second dynamic is that because of these distinctive political fissures, these distinctive intra-party divides this issue creates, when Congress has episodically acted to enact immigration reform, it's required the building of strange bedfellows. In turn, those strange bedfellows have often put together what's often described as grand bargains. I like to call them Faustian bargains. Quick examples. Again, Mr. Foster was very helpful in setting me up on this. I promise we did not talk ahead of time, which is he mentioned in the 1920s the Quota Acts. Well, here you get some of the first strange bedfellows. You had people like Samuel Gompers, who was the old head of the American Federation of Labor, teaming up with people like Henry Cabot Lodge, a senator who was a New England Brahmin worried about the status of WASPs in New England during this period. But what kind of grand bargains did you get? It was precisely as Mr. Foster said. On the one hand, you had overseas immigration that basically is ground to a halt. So that European immigration, Asian immigration faces enormous barriers. At the same time, the southern border remains very porous by design, because part of the coalition also included southern and western restrictionists who wanted to make sure that they had access to cheap labor coming from Mexico, or insatiable appetite for those workers. So fast forward, 1980s. You have Simpson, Rodino, Kennedy, and others. And so you have another strange bedfellow coalition, bipartisan, and you produce what you've probably heard ad nauseum today, this package of, employer sanctions, watered down employer sanctions, the toothless tiger, a legalization program, amnesty, plain and simple then, beefed up border control, and then finally an ag program, okay? So a third dynamic. Scope of conflict on this issue for Congress has expanded significantly. One of my favorite immigration scholars, Gary Freeman, from just down the road at UT Austin, wrote a very important article for Political Scientists in which he describes immigration reform politics as dominated by what he would call client politics. That is, a welter of special interest groups on the left and right who meet quietly, huddled elites, that's part of my title, who basically work out these deals behind closed doors. So growers, high-tech companies, a whole host of other employer groups, organized labor, immigration rights groups, religious groups, and so forth. Yet there's a time-bound quality to Professor Freeman's argument, because clearly the scope of conflict has been expanded dramatically since the 1990s. Grassroots mobilization on this issue, moreover, has created lots of cross pressures for members of Congress on immigration reform. And let me give you two renditions of this. The first is the 1990s. So California Prop 187, which I suspect folks have talked about a bit today, but California at that time was Arizona, in terms of there being lots of backlash to new immigration, lots of deep restiveness among ordinary citizens about perceived costs of undocumented immigration. And then only a few years later, Newt Gingrich pulls what seemingly then was the impossible in a takeover of the House that Democrats had dominated for generations. And in that context, House Republicans begin to seriously press for significant restrictions, thinking that they will seize on Reagan Democrats. Here's a wedge issue where we'll peel off a fair number of working class Democrats on this issue. And they actually get two things. One is more significant restrictions on due process rights and tougher border control for when it comes to undocumented immigration. And they also get through welfare reform, which targeted, one of the key components of that was targeting immigrants, including legal immigrants, to no longer have access to public benefits. But there is, so in each of these cases, you have lots of grassroots mobilization on the restrictive side of the equation that's helping propel this. That expands the scope of conflict. It's not just client politics, but there's a backlash in each case. So if you look at the 1990s, and if I had been on my game this morning, I would give you the slide, but I can tell you that naturalization levels explode after the passage of those two laws in 1996, which were viewed as restrictive and limiting immigrant rights. It just explodes. Likewise, Bill Clinton, ever being the crafty Paul, makes sure that at all those citizen oath ceremonies, there's someone there registering people to vote. There is a significant shift You can see in the '96 election, Ronald Reagan had spent a lot of time thinking about nurturing the Latino vote as something the Republican Party would have some inroads with. And by '96, it's a disaster for Bob Dole, and at least 2/3 of the vote goes to Bill Clinton. What about the 2000s? You have another example of the grassroots dimension of this, expanding the scope of conflict with post 9/11. Again, yeah, 3 minutes, no problem. And so Tom Tancredo emerges as somebody who's sort of the new George Wallace of American politics, capitalizing on this issue. And you have, the first presentation was great by Erica in terms of the role of Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and others getting in on the act on this issue. And so what you have by the time we get to 2005, 2006, and so forth, it looks like we're going to have possibly a reform as of old, which has strange bedfellows. It's the McCain-Kennedy legislation with a lot of help or shepherding by the Bush administration, and it all combusts, right, around a huge backlash from the conservative base, especially in the House. The James Sensenbrenner bill is a good example of this. Well, there's again a counter-mobilization that takes place that you all know well in terms of Latinos registering to vote and having higher turnout, the largest demographic, and the Republican brand is deeply hurt. 2008, Barack Obama doesn't just score more than 2/3 of the Latino vote, but in key swing states, Latino and Asian voters are critical. And then, of course, the 2012 election where he gets 71% of the vote. Okay. So right now, wrapping up quickly on these dynamics, I just want to emphasize the continuing importance of both client and grassroots politics. Let me just mention 3 turning points on why immigration reform is on the front burner, because it was ice cold for so long. The first turning point, June 14th, 2012, and we've already talked, it's been discussed a lot today already about Obama's directive for Dreamers. November 6th, the election day, 71% of the Latino vote. And its mobilizing effect for Republican leaders that if they want to stay in the game, they better respond to this fastest growing demographic in our electorate. And then what's been described as the Good Friday deal that just came out recently with the Chamber and AFL-CIO on a worker visa program of some kind. All right, so very quickly, Mark. I'm going to give you 2 other dynamics as something like those old Federal Express commercials. I hope it's not too quick. But the fourth dynamic I would have mentioned is the issue of, I guess I'd phrase it as a question, is how comprehensive is comprehensive immigration reform when Congress gets busy on this? Typically what happens in each of the earlier iterations is that you have this effort to combine efforts to reform legal immigration with undocumented immigration. And so this was true in the 80s with the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy. Senator Simpson and House Member Mazzoli had a similar thing in mind, and ultimately it was too big, and they ended up decoupling it, and it ended up becoming the 86 Act to deal with unauthorized and the 90 Act to deal with legal. 1990s, Lamar Smith, a name that should be familiar to a lot of you, in the House, has legislation that's going to combine both legal and undocumented immigration reform. And again, what happens? You get through the undocumented part of it. In the Senate, it gets defeated. So one of the things that's interesting right now is you hear over and over again that there's going to be legal immigration reform as part of this big comprehensive reform. And in particular, significant shifts from family preferences to skills in some new ways. So in the past, you've seen a decoupling of these things because it's too big to pull off. If it happens this time, I think it's a real interesting game changer. So last dynamic, which is, I'm going to invoke one of my old colleagues, Ross Baker, a famous Congress scholar who wrote wonderful work about the differences between the House and Senate. I can't do justice to that work right now, but let me just say that on immigration reform, the distinctions between the House and the Senate are usually quite significant. And what's interesting is in the 80s, the House was actually more pro-immigration and expansive on these issues, and it was the Senate, largely with the influence of Senator Simpson, that tended to be more cautious. I want to restrict conviction is too strong, but much more cautious about how expansive the reforms would be. In the 90s, particularly in the post-Gingrich takeover of the House, that shifts, and it becomes the Senate that tends to try to pursue a sensible middle way on these issues. In the 2000s, you have Kennedy to McCain, again, bipartisan compromise. The Senate is trying to come up with sensible solutions, and it's the House where you see lots of strong restriction coming from the base. So what about now? Well, now, the Gang of Eight, they're all senators, right? So bipartisan compromise coming from the Senate. We haven't heard enough about what's going on in the House. And in the House, I think therein lies the rub in terms of immigration reform. So let's put it this way. I think this issue got raised again during the Q&A of the last session, which is you have right now 50 of the Republican majority, only 50 of those Republicans in the House actually come from seats that you wouldn't describe as safe. That means that if you want to look at where there's, in the polling, where the Republicans in all the other seats, over 200, have a double-digit advantage in terms of Republicans to Dems in that district. So there's only 50 that are really competitive for Republicans. And I think actually there's an interesting dimension here in terms of public opinion on immigration reform that parallels that with gay marriage. That is, among the Republican base, 60% of Republicans, and particularly those who are likely to vote in primaries, oppose any kind of path to citizenship or legalization or something along those lines. And yet, 80% of Americans, the majority, believe that that those who are here should stay and believe some form of legal status ought to be proffered. Gay marriage has very similar numbers. So, again, what do you do if you're in the House? What do you do if you're John Boehner? Because, again, it goes back to something I mentioned before. If you want to be a national party, you need to be pursuing the Gang of Eight kind of reforms. But if you're one of those, other than the 50 Republicans who are from competitive seats, the other Republicans have very different motivations. Their biggest threat comes in the primaries, and they have to worry about that 60%. Now, on a hopeful note, the interesting thing is that the latest I've heard is that Eric Cantor has a proposal, actually maybe hopeful or not hopeful, and they have a proposal that, first of all, that it's quite likely that Boehner's going to suspend the Hastert rule. That is, to allow his members who want to defect to do so. You don't need a majority of Republicans to be on board with putting it to a vote. But then the second thing is that Cantor's idea is to do this piecemeal, is to divide it up into 7 or 8 different pieces in which you have to vote within 48 hours. So, you're going to get whiplash looking at the coalitions going back and forth. It's designed to create a situation where it allows those, among the 50 Republicans, some of them to join. You need almost a unified Democratic side. So in conclusion, James Galbraith always said for audiences, you have to say in conclusion to give them hope. Let me say that I'm actually, maybe I'm just an inveterate optimist, but I'm actually, think that we do have the best chance to get an immigration reform legislation, major immigration reform through than we've seen in a long time. And when's the last time you kind of had something that was significant and bipartisan that got through Congress? That said, the question is, what's going to be the nature of that bill? That's where I'm much more kind of suspect. And I think the devil will be in the details. Is it going to be, rather than a grand bargain, something that's closer to a Faustian bargain that we've seen in the past? So, thanks.
Just know that I'm not checking my messages. I'm just looking at the time.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I don't know if it's the problem or the distinction of being the last speaker, but let me also, I think, thank the organizers for inviting me. Not so sure about this slot. I was going to begin with my take on why it's so difficult to have immigration reform, but between Dan's presentation and Mark's comments this morning, I think I'm going to mostly skip that. Not very well done because I'm not a graphics artist. Take, though, is just a reminder that people have attitudes about immigration, and they also have attitudes about immigrants, and they're not necessarily the same. So there are people who are very pro-immigration, meaning they want lots of numbers of immigrants coming in, pro-immigrant rights. They're the traditionalist, traditional ethnic advocacy, immigrant advocacy groups. There, of course, in the lower right-hand quarter, those who don't want don't want immigration. They want very low levels of immigration. They don't want to see immigrants have very many rights. But the other two quadrants are the ones that keep shifting around. The top right quadrant are those that are very favorable towards large-scale immigration, but don't care as much about immigrant rights. They favor large-scale guest worker programs, bring people in to do work, to benefit the economy, but with relatively restricted rights and not membership in the society. And then there are those, and I'd say the labor unions tend to still be in that category. They're nervous about numbers, particularly if those numbers are guest workers. But they're very supportive of immigrant rights because those immigrants who are here, they hope will eventually become members of the unions. And they also want to make sure that the immigrants have enough rights that U.S. workers aren't harmed by their presence. And these coalitions shift depending on what the issue. Again, in combination with what Mark talked about, make it really hard to get agreement on specific policies, and particularly in an omnibus bill that's dealing with both issues of numbers of immigrants as well as immigrant rights. And having said that, let me spend most of my remarks outlining what I see as the current problems in immigration and what I see as the possible solutions, some of which are on the legislative calendar already, others of which I think aren't but should be. The current problem, certainly we've been talking during the course of today about unauthorized migration, and it clearly is a problem. 11 million people without legal status. We think about 60% came illegally across mostly the Mexico-U.S. border. About 40% of them have overstayed visas, arrived legally, but are no longer in legal status. At present, because of a confluence of factors, including some enforcement-related things, some developments in Mexico, but largely, I think, the state of the U.S. economy, net new illegal immigration is at about zero. And that makes this a very propitious time to do immigration reform because we're not doing it during a period in which there's massive new illegal immigration, but also where the timing is going to be really important because when the economy recovers and where particularly sectors like construction really start taking off again as we're seeing the beginnings of that, then the issue is going to come back up again. And if not from Mexico, then from elsewhere. Interestingly enough, unauthorized migration is much more responsive to changes in market trends. In economic trends. Although undocumented migration went way down, new arrivals into the country went down, legal immigration actually remained pretty much the same as it has been during both economic good times and economic bad times. And that leads to some questions about our current legal immigration system. And I would say the major problem there is that we have very inflexible ceilings and manage our legal admissions, both in our permanent programs and our temporary work programs, through waiting lists and backlogs. Rather through a determination of what is in the national interest of the country, and then determining numbers and categories of admission based on those national interests. Quickly give you some ideas of what these backlogs are. In the immediate family, spouses, minor children of legal permanent residents, we're now down to about a 2.5-year backlog. Just a few years ago, though, legal permanent resident had to wait for anywhere from 6 to 10 years in order to sponsor their family members. Part of the reason we have some of the undocumented migration, why a lot of undocumented migrants are in mixed families because of these terribly long backlogs. But others are even worse in terms of the backlogs. For Mexicans, we're now admitting the adult unmarried children of U.S. citizens who applied in 1993. So they applied 20 years ago. These are the petitions that Mr. Foster was talking about before. Even worse for the siblings of U.S. citizens, if you applied, were coming in from the Philippines, you will have applied in 1989, 24-year backlog. That means that most of the siblings are arriving closer to the time of retirement than they are to the time that they're at the most productive work years. Not exactly a flexible system. In some cases, the employment-based system is equally problematic. If you have an advanced degree, a master's or a PhD from India, you have about a 9-year wait to get a green card. Most of them are working here as temporary workers, but it's year after year after year. China, it's about a 5-year wait. And we have long waits for those with a bachelor's degree as well. They're even a little bit longer for India than the advanced degrees are. So that way of managing immigration just doesn't work. A third problem is that we have inadequate mechanisms to protect the rights of migrant workers and U.S. workers in those same industries. We heard a lot about that in the construction industry today, where we don't have fair competition. Employers who want to follow the rules, in effect, have a disadvantage compared to those who are perfectly willing to bring in migrant workers, undocumented, but also in some cases temporary workers, to game the system and be able to have an economic advantage, but in the process often violating wage and hour rules, occupational safety and health rules, and other abusive practices. A fourth issue is that one of the fastest growing parts of our immigration system has been of temporary work programs. And those have actually expanded quite significantly over the last 20 years. But temporary is not usually temporary. Some of the programs that we refer to as temporary work programs allow 6 or 7 year visas. In some cases, because the permanent system is so backlogged, people get a year-by-year extension of their temporary status until the green card becomes available. We also know from the history of immigration programs that if you have a temporary work program for permanent jobs, that tends not to work. Employers don't want to lose good workers, and if you had a really good temporary worker who had, after 3 years had to go home, would you really want that to occur if you've spent the time training that worker? So employers don't want it to be truly temporary, and workers begin to develop equities. They, particularly if they could bring their families, their kids start school, they don't want to take them out of school. So the dynamic is against it. Agricultural programs, seasonal work, you can make a temporary worker program work. But indefinite jobs, that isn't necessarily the best way to go. Fifth problem, inefficiencies in immigration management. We have historically not put very many resources into our immigration systems, whether on the enforcement side or on the legal admissions side. We've tried to redress that on the enforcement side in terms of border security, have not done it in terms of worksite enforcement, particularly not on labor standards enforcement. Those systems are terribly, terribly broken. And on the legal admissions side, although the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services has done a really heroic job with limited resources in reducing administrative barriers and waiting times for admissions, it's always tottering on the brink of failing And my concern is that if this bill puts a whole lot more pressure on that agency, it will fail big time. And so that is a problem for the future. And then 6, an issue that hasn't come up at all today, is that we have some serious problems in our humanitarian admissions programs, particularly refugee admissions, for resettlement and for asylum, probably the most egregious of which is that after 9/11, we put in provisions that say that if you provide material support to a terrorist organization, you can't come in the U.S. I think we'd all agree with that. Except terrorist organizations are basically defined as 2 or more people who come together to fight a regime. And so we've labeled some of our allies in Iraq, for example, as terrorist organizations because they fit this very difficult definition. Plus, we also apply it to people who are coerced into providing support. I interviewed an Iraqi who was still waiting for permission, the security clearance to come in, and the basic problem was that his family had paid a ransom to free him when he was kidnapped by one of the al-Qaeda groups. And because they paid a ransom, he was not eligible to come to the U.S. So problems in that area. So what's needed? How much time do I have since? Okay.
Not much.
All right. 1, worksite enforcement. I think to think that we can solve the problem of undocumented migration totally at the border is foolhardy. If nothing else, because 40% of those who are here illegally come in with legal authorization. That's a large part of the undocumented population, a tiny part of all the border crossers. And you have to keep that in mind, that just ratcheting up the inspections process is not going to do much to get at that number when it may be a couple of 100,000 people when the levels of undocumented flows were the highest. Now, much, much smaller percentage who are overstaying, smaller absolute number overstaying. Out of, 450 million border crossings in the San Diego sector alone? I mean, so we're talking about minuscule numbers related to the size of our legal flows. So, Dimitri said we've thought all along that the job magnet is the problem. I still think that is the issue. People come here illegally, they stay illegally to get jobs. We need to improve the E-Verify system. There have been improvements over the last few years in terms of reducing the false negatives. I think it's down to about 1% now. But that's of a pilot program. When it's expanded to be a mandatory program, number one, 1% is a large number of people out of a nationwide mandatory program, but also the program in our analysis is not ready to be expanded to that number of people. But from an enforcement point of view, the other problem is the large number of false positives, people who don't have the authorization to work, but are able to, as we heard before, use someone else's social security number and name. And so E-Verify right now isn't capable of functioning. And without a biometric to really determine who the person is, it's unlikely to be particularly effective. But even there, if we manage to have an E-Verify system that works, we still need worksite enforcement in the terms of labor standards enforcement, because some of the businesses will go underground. And if we don't have a mechanism for addressing that, what we're ending up with is an even more exploitable workforce that has very few protections in terms of their labor rights. Legalization, my view is we should keep it as simple as possible and as exclusive as possible. Politically, we're probably going to have to put on all sorts of ridiculous requirements in order to prove that we're tough. In doing it, for every one of those additional requirements, we'll have growth in, number one, the counterfeiting industry. That happened the last time around, likely to happen again. And number two, will make it difficult for people to apply, particularly if the penalties. I'm actually less worried about the paying of back taxes because I think most people will be eligible for a refund. I'm not quite sure why we're harping on that one, since if the last the survey that was done after the last legalization holds true, majority have worked in jobs where their taxes were withheld, but they could never claim a refund, even though they're low-wage workers and would have been eligible for a refund. So we'll see how that one works out. Biggest issue is that it's getting very little public attention right now, hopefully more in the way of the congressional discussions, is what about family reunification for those who legalize. That was ignored in IRCA originally. There was a catch-up trying to address it in later years, but there are two forms. If it's true what is being talked about in the papers that legalization will apply to those who are working and can show that continued employment. Does that mean children don't get legalized? Does it mean that the 15-year-old is encouraged to drop out of school to get a job in order to be legalized? What about the stay-at-home spouse? We have to deal with all of those issues to make sure that there aren't unintended consequences. But what about the families still in Mexico and Central America, in China, or whatever? Are we going to go back now with a much larger number of people potentially legalized to these very, very long waiting times, which will be an encouragement for undocumented migration to start back up again? Legal reform, we need to clear those backlogs. And I agree with Dimitri that politically it's a difficult decision to make, but saying the legalized should be behind everyone else doesn't make sense when they're behind a ridiculously long backlog, which isn't in our national interest. But we also need to make reforms in our legal permanent residence system to make it easier for spouses of minor children to come in. It may be, and I believe it probably has to be, at the expense of continuing to have categories for brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens and probably also married children, because those categories are so backlogged right now that they're not functioning very effectively. Temporary programs, yes, but only for temporary workers. And that will be a challenge of how to frame them in a way that actually deals with that issue. Two last points. Senator Leahy in the last Congress introduced Refugee Protection Act. I hope that when the bill finally reaches the Judiciary Committee in the Senate that there's an opportunity to bring that act into the legislation in order to address some of the problems in our refugee admissions. And then my last point is that we really have to figure out and pay attention to the efficiency of the institutions that are going to be implementing the reforms, the transparency to be able to get information out of those organizations, be able to evaluate and assess how well they're doing in implementation, and that's a problem right now. And finally, we need the resources. This is a bad budget climate to be talking about increased resources, but relying totally on fees will not help solve some of these systemic problems in our immigration system. So to conclude, the legislation is only the first step. Whatever happens in terms of the legislative process, I'm in the camp of being cautiously optimistic, although worried about what the bill actually is and states. But implementation is going to be the key challenge, and without an appropriate resources, political will, administrative capacity to implement what's going to be a monumental undertaking if there is comprehensive immigration reform, all will either rise or fall on that capacity.
So we go until 6:30 or 7? You complain about having the last slot, but I really have the last slot. After the first slot, when no one even had their coffee yet. Let me offer my disclaimer again that I'm going to be speaking to you not to represent the Congressional Research Service or the Library of Congress, and I'm even going to talk a little bit about actual policy things now. So I really say that disclaimer. And let me also, again, thank the organizers and especially thank the panelists. That was really a great wrap-up to a big day. So I'm going to, I'll say a couple, I'll address the first two presenters sort of in order, and then I'm going to do Dan and Susan together because, because that's going to be easier. And their papers and their comments dealt with some of the same issues. So let me just offer a little bit of feedback on Erica and her co-author's paper. And let me start by saying it's a very ambitious project. It's, in general, to try to explain the relationship among how the media presents an issue, how the political process manages that issue, or how that issue plays out in the political process, and how political agents seek to shape the issue. Those are all mutually reinforcing, and all three of those arrows run, among each other. So methodologically and sort of intellectually, it's a very challenging question. And then when you add on top of that the fact that you're looking at a moment of rapidly changing and evolving media environment, as you pointed out, so you've got a moving target there, and then also the moving target of sort of how we understand immigration issues, and then also the complexity of the immigration issue and the difficulty of sort of objectively defining, how a particular immigration story is framed and presented. I know that you know this, but I'm just validating your view that this is a hard project you've taken on. But I also think that. I think you hit on a hugely important point, both in the paper and in your comments today, that if you're going to identify sort of one, other than the three turning points that Dan mentioned, which I think are also quite, correct, one other turning point, one sort of macro, framing turning point is the shift of the narrative away from, that unauthorized immigrants have have violated the law, and that the challenge with legalization is that how can we reward immigrants for having broken the law, and that everybody has to be held individually accountable. The shift from that narrative to the focus on the dream kids who were brought here by the parents and didn't do anything wrong and therefore deserve legalization. So that the focus on the dream kids really has played out rhetorically in a very different way than the broader legalization debate did in 2006 and 2007, I think, when the Dreamers, that was it was such a given that, well, we're going to do Dream as part of this, that nobody really looked much at that. And so I think that the activism by the Dreamers to do civil disobedience and get themselves on the agenda really was important in sort of pushing the Obama administration forward probably faster than they wanted to once they put it forth on their list, as Charles pointed out. So it highlights the importance of framing and agenda setting, but to me that was very much agent driven. I mean, they were out there forcing the media to cover them. And there's a really interesting, and somebody else was talking about I guess it was Dan, and somebody earlier today, I think, was talking about comparisons between the immigrant rights movement and the gay rights movement, or the marriage equality movement. And Frank Sherry has done some really interesting and important, and I think just dead on writing about this, including how the immigrant rights movement purposely modeled itself on the gay rights movement. So you should take a look at that. And then shifting attention to Charles's comments, first of all, I apologize for my ignorance. There were two people at the table who have had a front row seat to all of this recent history. I think, I thought your comments were right on about, the importance of, we can explain a lot about the failure of President Bush and President Obama to get this high priority done by the fact that it wasn't the top priority, and neither of them really got to their number 2 issue, or certainly didn't get to their number 3 or 4 issue. And even now, it appears that immigration is sort of the top issue, but immigration has to go through the Judiciary Committee, and gun control is also sort of the top issue, and that's a Judiciary Committee issue. And then if somebody on the Supreme Court steps down, all bets are off. So we have to, people talk about why it's important to do this quickly, but to me, that's actually among the most important reasons why it's important to do it quickly. I also thought your comments about sort of the legal construction of illegal immigration hugely important. And, I think people who study this a lot understand that, but I think very few people realize that there are essentially no unauthorized immigrants in this country before 1965 and the changes that you were talking about, end of the Rossetto program. And then I also think, and it's a narrative that comes up a lot in the congressional debate, the perceived failures of the 1986 IRCA, and what are the lessons that we can learn from IRCA. One set of lessons that you mentioned is, or just in terms of how we talk about immigration reform, the shift from amnesty to earned legalization, the concept of the back of the line. But of course, the failure to establish an effective worksite enforcement system, we've all mentioned, clearly is, in my mind, the number 1 lesson. But I think the other lesson that people flag that I hear come up on the Hill a lot is that there's a perception that that's part of a bait and switch, that IRCA promised comprehensive reform in the sense of combining legalization and these new enforcement provisions, and it didn't deliver on the enforcement provisions. I don't think IRCA was actually quite sold that way. I think really IRCA was about worksite enforcement and didn't do its primary thing, and the other things were sort of sweeteners to bring the left along. But in any case, Dan brought up, how comprehensive does comprehensive have to be? On one level, politically, it has to convince people that we're serious about enforcement this time. And we're not going to get an infinite number of additional swings at this apple, or bites at this apple, whatever the expression is. So as Dimitri pointed out, we really do need to get enforcement right this time. And so at least in that way, both politically and policy-wise, it's critical to figure out how to do the key enforcement pieces, worksite enforcement and an effective E-Verify system or an effective verification system, along with whatever legalization and additional reforms we're going to do. So let's see. Let me now shift to Susan and Dan's papers. And I'm going to, I have sort of separate notes, and I have some little comments that I'll discuss with you all offline. But I want to try to pull out, I guess, 5 points that sort of appeared in both of your papers and comments, and just say a little bit more about some of them. So the strange bedfellows, and Susan's diagram, this is one of the most interesting, and we've all sort of looked at it, but it remains a very interesting aspect of immigration policy that you have these cross-cutting coalitions and cross-cutting interests on the issue. And I think I'm partial to Susan's, I'm partial to thinking of it in terms of the two-dimensional space that looks at numbers and rights. And I think that, I think that that's particularly a useful approach because it does a good job of capturing, in Dan's paper, he talks about people like Senator Eastland, who, was hardcore opposed to opening up legal permanent immigration from Europe, but also hardcore opposed to restricting unauthorized or temporary worker, at that point, temporary work programs from Mexico. And, that's a perfectly coherent position if you want big numbers, low rights. It's not really a border hawk and it's not really economic protectionist. It's just big numbers, low rights. And that's, it's important to think in terms of how many people are we going to admit, what are the numbers, and under what terms are they going to be admitted, and that determines how much of our energy we're putting into lawful permanent resident reform and what we're doing with green cards versus what are we doing with a new temporary worker program. We're creating a vast new temporary worker program, and then what kind of rights will those temporary workers have? But to a certain extent, what the labor unions will tell you is that if it's a truly temporary worker program, they don't have the same kind of rights as lawful permanent residents, and so that's already making a big concession. All right, and I can't read this piece of my writing, so I'm not going to make that point. But I'm sure it was very sharp. So let me go to the second thing that they both brought up in various ways, and I think maybe more in Susan's paper than in her comments. But Dan described the scope of conflict and the shift from client politics to mass politics. And from my analysis of the 2006 and 2007 debates is that that's almost the whole story of how that blew up in Congress at the time, because every key, elite interest group that's interested in immigration signed on to the 2006 deal, to a lesser extent in 2007, because in 2007, there were key groups that opposed it. But, that was, the Senate switchboards were literally shut down by so many people calling in to oppose that bill. Because of this sort of mass backlash against it. And so that also highlights the importance of Erica's research. It also, that's the reason that the Republican Party and that Republicans in the House find themselves in this conflict over the party's national interests and, what many people in the earlier presentations sort of seem to describe as, well, clearly what our national interest in an immigration reform is versus their reelection interests. It's because of this mass backlash. They wouldn't face that primary threat if it weren't for the fact that this has become such a broadly, an issue that there's such broad interest in. But it also relates, and this is the point that Susan talks about in her paper that she didn't mention in her comments, to the difference between the role of sort of immigration expertise in shaping the immigration process. So in the previous big immigration debates in the 80s and the 90s, these high-level commissions like the Hesburgh Commission and the Jordan Commission that Susan was involved in, both of them, were very influential in sort of helping policymakers understand what the issues were. And, there's really no talk of something like that now because everybody's an expert on immigration now. The closest thing we have to that is the Gang of Eight sort of playing a quasi-expert role. But, in contrast to the 80s, once the Gang of Eight throws their ideas out there, it's not like anybody in Congress is going to defer to them. They're all going to offer their own amendments and they're all going to have their own take on it. And it's a very different dynamic. And I think that's also part of the mass interest in the issue. So I'm going on longer than I intended, but I'm going to make 3 more quick points. One is that I think Dan's observation about the difference between the House and the Senate, I agree that it's almost easy to forecast what kind of bill is likely to emerge from the Senate. It's not really because of what I just said, but the House, all bets are off, depending on whether the Hastert rule applies or not, and even just regardless, we just don't know a lot less about where the internal negotiations are in the House and what role the Judiciary Committee is going to play there, partly because in the Senate, it's partly because the Senate is controlled by the Democrats and the House is not, but also just because that process has been a lot more opaque, and we haven't had a debate over there in a few years. Next point, Dan raised the question: how comprehensive is comprehensive? I already said a little bit that I think that politically, it's going to be very difficult to put together a coalition that does this piecemeal. I also think that it's easy to lose sight of the enforcement that's already been done, and Dimitri made this point earlier, but the border and jails, the enforcement that goes on in the U.S. at jails and prison, those have been, radically transformed what the immigration enforcement system looks like just compared to a few years ago, much less compared to, 10 or 20 years ago. So with the caveat that we don't have a worksite enforcement system, we've done a big piece of comprehensive reform, but there's this skepticism after IRCA. So, how to sort of prove that stuff matters. But I think that there's also been some important social science research starting to emerge that shows that these enforcement measures really matter. I think that academics and the left are, sort of deeply in the habit of saying that, oh, enforcement doesn't matter and nothing we do on the border matters. But I think there's increasingly evidence that that may have been true for, between the 1970s and about 2005 or so, but with all the investment that's been done at the border, and, in 2006, DHS identified 25,000 removable aliens within the U.S. Last year, they identified 425,000 because of secure communities and this huge infrastructure for finding people within the U.S. I'm not sure that follows directly on how comprehensive is comprehensive, but it's a point that needs to be made. And then the last point I want to bring up is to ask, so a lot of what we've talked about on this last panel and to a certain extent all day is the politics of what an immigration bill would look like and how to sort of put together a coalition. I think that there's also a question about, are there innovative policies that make it easier to achieve, that are somewhat different than everything else that we've talked about, and some, is anything that the Gang of Eight or that the House negotiators are thinking about different from the 2006 bill and the 2007 bill in a way that makes that makes a deal more viable, either because it's innovative, on a policy level, or because it changes those coalitions. And I think that, I think it's an open question whether, for example, the little tweaks that we're talking about to the temporary worker program to do provisional visas instead of truly temporary visas to increase mobility, if we do different things with what the attestation process and the labor certification process might look like, whether those are sort of game changers policy-wise and therefore politically. And then likewise, whether a legalization program that doesn't have a path to citizenship, and I understand your point, your objections to that term, but let me put it this way, that doesn't have a promise of an LPR visa, but is just a long-term legal status without an LPR visa, does that sort of address concerns about fairness, and or political anxiety about new citizens that make a deal more viable? So I will give y'all a break. And I guess and I'll field questions. I think they want you to wait for the microphone because you're being recorded.
I can't speak from the perspective of an immigration lawyer, but I can speak from the perspective of a tax lawyer. And I'm very concerned, Susan, about your conclusion that you're not concerned about the taxes, because there may have been a lot of taxes that have been withheld from employees, but each one of these people is going to have to prove what his own income is and his own tax liability is. And if presumably these people haven't filed returns, and if you're talking about a number of years, you've got the taxes, you've got the daily compound interest, you've got the penalties, to say nothing of the fact that although Texas doesn't have an income tax, California's got the highest state income tax in the country, and they're going to want that piece of it too. I can't imagine that there are going to be many of these undocumented immigrants who haven't been paying taxes who are going to be able to meet that criterion if we have that.
No,
built
I
into the
was
path
being a
of
bit
citizenship.
facetious in the way in which I said it, because I think the whole idea of retroactively requiring tax payments is a huge mistake, because it's a mistake for all the agencies that are going to have to deal with figuring out what's what.
I can't imagine the Internal Revenue Service
I know.
taking on 1 million more cases or 11 million more cases to determine the taxes of all
I
of
was
these.
saying it because it's being talked about in Congress as, this is another way we can show that they're not getting, something for nothing, that we're holding their feet to the fire. And I think it's a ridiculous idea because it's, both unnecessary. I mean, in some respects, thinking about people who have paid, had their taxes withheld and who never were able to put a return in and therefore have never been able to claim the kinds of refunds that they would have gotten given their low wages. I think, it would actually, in one respect, be very good if they go through that process. But on the other hand, I think it'll paralyze so much of the system. And then when we think about the Social Security taxes, a lot of which have gone into Social Security, and I remember from IRCA legalization how much time and effort it took Social Security to sort out whose money was really whose. Because if you're now employed with E-Verify or the regular I-9 with somebody else's name and Social Security number, that person is getting the benefit of the money that the undocumented worker has been putting in, so it means having to reconcile all of those. It's going to be a mess anyway, but to do it in order to show we're being tough, I think is taking on something which doesn't really make very much sense whatsoever, just in order to, the politics it's a good political soundbite, they have to pay their back taxes, but it ignores the fact that many of them had their taxes withheld, they paid into Social Security, they've never gotten any benefits out of that process, and now we're going to have to reconcile all of that information and money.
Going back to the issue of taxes and the paying back the taxes that they owe. I wonder, and this is a question not only for the panel here, for whoever was in the other panels since the morning, still here in the audience. If there is any data of how, what percentage of illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants have already been paying taxes. I know for a fact, and this is pure evidence of not documented, I mean, just anecdotal evidence. I was born in Mexico. I was lucky enough that my husband was already here, so I became a citizen. But I talked to a lot of people about this. I like talking to people about their stories, their personal stories. And a lot of people that I talk to, they are paying taxes. They have a tax identification number, and they have been paying taxes for years. Some of them have already applied for residency through a family member, but others don't have any family member that is legal, but they are hoping that there will be an amnesty, and they know if they have been paying taxes, they will help them for the amnesty. Is there any data on what is the percentage of people that have been paying taxes for years and years?
Yeah, I mean, the PMA have other sources, but I was basing my observation on the survey that was done of the 2.9 million or so who legalized as a result of the 1986 law. And the survey showed that the majority had taxes withheld from their paychecks. At that time, we didn't have the employee identification number system quite in place, so most of them, the money disappeared as far as they knew. They didn't know whether the employer actually gave it to the IRS or whether the employer pocketed that money or what happened to it. But the majority did say that, and it was my memory was that it was a fairly significant majority, said that they were working in jobs where taxes were being withheld.
I know that the CBO and others have looked at that, and I don't have the exact number in my head either, but I believe the CBO, I think that the estimate is about 60% have taxes withheld currently.
Of the 11 million number?
Of those who are employed, so of the 8 million.
Okay.
Yeah. On behalf of
But is
them.
each individual worker going to be able to show that taxes were withheld from his particular salary?
No, I totally agree that among all of the challenges that legalizing immigrants are going to face in documenting the various things they're going to have to document, that's going to be among the hardest. Is Pia and there's a microphone. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Speak up. My question is, are they going to owe payroll tax?
We haven't seen the legislative language.
I mean, they're not going to get any money back if they're going to have to pay their payroll tax, right?
Right.
I mean, that's going to be huge money.
Right, except that some of them had that withheld, but yes.
No, I'm talking about the ones who didn't.
Right.
Does that their back tax include payroll tax? I mean, they may not owe any income tax.
The language
surely
in
they'll owe their payroll tax, which is going to be a lot of money.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, the language in 2006 was something along the lines of all back taxes. And it would be left up to, regulators would figure out how to define that.
This is a question for Charles. What is an appropriate fine to get over the tax cost? What about just a fine?
Yes.
I don't know whether it's 2,500, 5,000, whatever. Would it be appropriate for them to pay it over time?
Thanks, Judy. I think you're. What I think about the fine, 2 or 3 things. One, it's got to be enough to get to sort of meet the smell test for the Republicans, because you hear the mantra saying these people broke the law, and so the most extreme reaction to that is they must go home. So the sort of compromise on that is they must pay a fine. So actually, if that's what it takes, I'm for it. But it's got to be a realistic amount. It's been suggested, just like you said, that it should be paid over a period of time. The rights to work here in the U.S., to get here, is an extraordinarily valuable right. And I would rather, sometimes the enemy of the good is perfection. I think some people are going to want to protect this class of people so much we may not wind up with a final bill. I'd like to see a final bill, even if that dollar amount's a little bit, it may make some uncomfortable. With that proviso, you just suggested that it could be paid out over a period of time. I've heard different dollar amounts along the line you've suggested, lower and higher.
So we're going to take one more question over here, and then I'll ask the rest of the panelists, or all the panelists, if they want to make any closing thoughts.
Thank you all for your great presentations. I just wanted to, as we conclude here, make a quick plug for, I guess, starting to think about how we can start to incorporate immigration policy into how we think about international policy. So we tend in the United States to think of this as an exclusively domestic policy issue, which makes sense given our current context in terms of how we think about policy making in general. But I wondered, given that the work that each of you have done, how much can we learn from past experiences about the role of binational policymaking and also international policy and even regional policymaking, and what do the lessons of NAFTA tell us about moving forward if we're going to address the flow issue? We tend to be obsessed about the kind of pull factors, but what do we know about what policymaking needs to happen outside of kind of the domestic realm?
Actually, I was going to jump in and say, I think it's a great question. I want to weigh in on the refugee issue, because that's where we've seen numbers drop dramatically, and I find it very disquieting. If you want to look at political philosophers like Michael Walzer, they use the phrase "the most necessitous strangers," and so there's real, moral as well as practical geopolitical reasons why we should be better in our refugee policy. And when I think about the first major reform, Mr. Foster, I think, set us up perfectly by thinking about this long period where we had quotas, national origins quotas, that lasted from basically 1920 through 1965. So for most of the 20th century, we had these really racist restrictions. What began to erode those restrictions was a commitment to international leadership after World War II and to addressing the needs of refugees. That's where we first started to get progressive immigration reform. In that area, I'm concerned that we don't talk enough about these commitments that we ought to have.
Yeah. If I could also add on, not just on the refugee side, which obviously from my remarks I feel is an area that is not getting enough attention in the debate, but I think also there is some interest, and I'm not sure whether it'll find its way into legislation or not, but from some discussions that I've had with members of Congress and their staff, in trying to think through some better mechanisms for bilateral collaboration with Mexico over our joint border, particularly in the context of the fact that Mexico is increasingly becoming not just a transit but also a destination country for immigration from Central America, and working more collaboratively. In the time that I was in government in the 1990s, we had a pretty vibrant binational commission that met regularly, out of it came things like the commuter lanes now on the Mexican border, and a variety of other efforts to both facilitate migration between the two countries, but also to ramp up the Mexican border controls and ability to deal with violence along their border. That's basically gone. And there are some other things in terms of border security that has replaced it at the working level and between Homeland Security and their Interior Department concept. But I think that what we used to have was the ability to talk about migration in the context of all of the other bilateral problems, whether it was education or healthcare or environment and issues of that type. I think this is particularly important because of the return migration into Mexico. We have a study coming out in the next few weeks that's looked at return migration, and particularly, though, of U.S. citizen children now living in Mexico. And the numbers are quite significant, about 300,000 U.S. citizen children. The total number of return migrants looks like it's about a million. And though the flow of return hasn't shifted a whole lot, but just as we have less circulation of people coming and going back, returnees now are staying in Mexico longer. So issues of education, healthcare, et cetera, for these kids are a binational concern. If they're not getting reintegrated into schools in Mexico, for example, that's going to have import when they come back to the United States, which they can at any time that they want to as U.S. citizens. So I think we definitely need to be shifting the way in which we speak. One last point, though, I don't think what will ever fly, though, is special policies with regard to a single country. And I think that that's part of what was the problem in the original Bush-Fox negotiations. It was also a lot of other countries were saying, well, what about us? You can't just have a deal with Mexico. And Congress, of course, even before 9/11 was saying, this is our deal. We make immigration policy. The two presidents can agree on something, but that doesn't necessarily mean we're going along with it. So yes to international, but carefully.
Before Tony gives 10-15 minutes of closing remarks, I want to thank him because he's been absolutely instrumental in getting this conference done and in helping me reach out to the speakers and give them feedback. So really, I'm super thrilled to have you as part of the Baker Institute as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I also want to thank everybody who's behind the scenes. And if any of you have organized a conference, you know how complicated all the details are. I have a fantastic team of coworkers who've done this possible. So thanks to them.
Yeah, I promise I'll only, it'll be about 2 or 3 minutes only because I know it's been a long day. But let me begin with some things that I think came out of the conference. Obviously, it is a difficult, thorny issue. It is a third rail issue with many, many different groups and many different items tugging at it. We obviously know that Congress has to resolve several important issues that have to do with border security and the definition of border security. I think we don't have one. And this is where I think local governments in Texas and Arizona and California can contribute to that debate. We hope that legislators can enter that debate and figure out what exactly border security means. If they do not solve that problem of border security, that definition, I think it may actually stop the bill. They have to solve the status of the undocumented resident population. That is a big issue. We allowed that problem to get very, very bad over the last 27 years or so. I think it is to some extent a kind of a partially a manufactured crisis in the sense that even though it is 11 million people, the entry of undocumented workers on average is about 500. Now it's down to about 250,000 a year on the U.S.-Mexico border, and we're talking about a manageable number of visas if the government just dealt with that and expanded that. 400 million people cross the U.S. Borders every year. 400 million. If you think about 250, 300,000, 350,000 people crossing without papers, percentage-wise, it's a very, very small percentage. I think it can be dealt with if we put it in the perspective of the number of people that visit, work, come in and out of the United States, all the tourists, all the business people, the shoppers that we see in the Houston Galleria all the time. I think we can deal with that. The other issue that Congress has to deal with is the visa system. It has become clear over the course of the day that the visa system is broken. It's perhaps not the immigration system, but it is the visa system itself. There are no visas for a certain amount of workers. The system is largely based on family reunification. That is clear. 70-80% of the visas, a couple of numbers came up, are about family reunification. 140,000 of that million visas a year are actually workers. And we know that when the U.S. economy is humming along, the number of visas are needed, and not highly skilled, but mid-skilled workers. And I think it was clear that it's low-skilled, mid-skilled, and high-skilled people. There are different visas, and there are not enough visas for those kinds of workers that we need. Of course, the problem is unemployment, as Dimitri pointed out today, and we don't know how that's going to play out. If we have 22 million people without work, why are we going to admit another million or 500,000 workers every year? Luring those people back into the labor market would mean, though, that we have to reconsider wages and benefits and such in the United States, because for a lot of people, it's simply not worth working for $7.25 an hour. And in that sense, I think we have another issue that kind of interjects that problem. Finally, or a couple of things, the backlog, I think that's another problem of the U.S. government. A lot of the billions and billions of dollars, $18 billion a year that are thrown at immigration enforcement, at least 1 or 2 ought to be thrown at reducing the backlog. If there are 3 million people or 4.5, it depends on how you calculate the numbers, we ought to throw the money there to reduce that backlog and figure out that way.
Right.
What is it?
It's statutory numerical limits. It's not.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, the problem is that there's also a cap on the visa system, the types and the numbers and the national quotas and that kind of stuff. So you need to kind of tweak with several things, not just the. But at some point, I mean, you have to tweak with the types and numbers of visas, and then provide the resources to process people. And then the other thing is. Consider worksite enforcement. I think that is an important point. That will mean that we will have to give up our privacy to some extent, allow the government to collect information on us, put it in a major database so that any one of us that is applying for a job can quickly cleared and verified and do that. There is a controversy with some of the mindset in this country that we should not provide the government this information, but corporations already have it and have a lot of information on us, and perhaps the government will just be another entity that will have considerable information on us. So I think all these things cut across there. What are the things that a few things that I identify as key in this reform? One will be the coalitions that will be possible and probable. And I think we saw the Democrats have a stand. Some Democrats are divided, more conservative, rural, urban, West, the South, and so forth. We have the Republicans also being tugged at in different directions. So you also have certain different mathematics there in terms of the coalitions that are possible. I think the elections of 2012 made it possible for some Republicans to kind of move to the center and perhaps sort of fuzz their stance a little bit and maybe cross over and build a coalition that is sufficient to pass immigration reform. Depends on the rules in Congress and such. But I think it may be the best opportunity to get as many Democrats to the center, get as many Republicans as can come into the center, and then do it. However, I think coalitions are also built, and it'll depend on the leadership. It'll depend on the leadership. And this is where I think President Obama has failed to some extent. I think he needs to really be out there and really lead the charge on this issue. It seems to me that on many things, President Obama makes a public statement, makes the charge, and then steps back and fades out. I think he needs to be out there. He needs to really get congressional members, much as he has tried on the budget issue, and try to see if he can manage that coalition. He has, I think, a better chance at managing a coalition on immigration than he does on the federal budget deficit. So I think he needs to kind of exercise that. The civil society, I think, needs to organize as well. I think just as there is a rally today, I think we need to kind of make our voices heard in the direction of the things that we want to see. And of course, part of it had to do with changing the discourse. I think the elections of 2012 went a long way to change the discourse to some extent, opening an opportunity, but we definitely have to take advantage of that before it closes, because I think the risk of this opportunity for immigration reform closing is definitely there. The piecemeal approach, I have always favored a piecemeal approach. It depends on what is possible. If something comprehensive fails, I think smaller bills can be introduced to segment the population and deal with different groups, just like the Dreamers, and we can eventually segment these 11 million people and sort of try to pass that, or introduce different visas at different times and maybe achieve reform over a long time with a piecemeal approach, but that will definitely take years to do. The nature of the bill is going to be very important. Everybody's going to get a piece of the action. Everybody has to be satisfied. Everybody has to be able to go back home, their states, their districts, and take something, or at least be able to justify the position that they took and the vote that they cast or on the potential immigration bill. They have to be able to take cover from the right or the left or any other potential attack. So the shape of the bill is, I think, very uncertain. We don't know exactly what's going to contain. There's a lot of fine print negotiations going on right now. We'll find out what the bill is, what the proposed bill is now, but we will not know what the law is until we see the president sign it. And then we will have to go back and fix whatever they didn't accomplish at that time. So clearly this is a very, very difficult process, and I'm not overly optimistic. I'm not overly pessimistic. I think we're 50-50 right now, even though the environment seems to be shifting in favor. But I think there is a possibility, but I think the time window will close if we do not move quickly, and in that I agree with Mark. It's a quick thing. Even if it is a deformed bill, it has to be done quickly, and then we can go back and fix it. Because if we wait too long, the window will close and other issues will show up, and then we'll lose the opportunity. Let me just thank the Latin American Initiative for their invitation so that I spent these months here at the Baker Institute organizing this conference. Let me thank the authors. I think we had 16 great presentations, and 14 solid papers. They are available on the website of the Latin American Initiative. Let me thank the Baker Institute for the great interest. Secretary Baker and Ambassador DeRegan and Director of the Latin American Initiative, Erica de la Garza, and all the people that were behind this effort to put this together. And let me thank also the Racy Fish Foundation, which provided a generous grant to carry out this project. There's obviously a lot of interest. We did not expect it to be that timely. We didn't time it at all. And the authors can tell you that we contacted them first in June, July last year. We just didn't expect it to be this timely, that even as we're debating, the bill is being drafted. I don't know if we're too early or too late. We'll figure it out. But I think it is certainly a conversation that is going on, and we're happy to have in Houston at Rice University in the Baker Institute. And thank you all for your patience over a long day.